One of the great questions that has emerged in the first quarter of the 21st century has been a question of governance. That question being, is it better to have authoritarian governance, or is it better to have more traditional Western style, less authoritarian governance? Now, I know the devil is always in the details, and many would make the argument and can make the argument that, in fact, the West is highly authoritarian. I'm not going to deny that necessarily, but when we talk about traditional authoritarianism, we typically look to the regimes of the past, Soviet Russia, the killing fields of Cambodia, and so on. And the reason why we pose this question is because of the substantial power that the Middle Kingdom has. Now, the Middle Kingdom is the go-to for this discussion. And we can see this by way of looking at recent events and things that the Middle Kingdom's government has done. For example, sometime last year, the famous Middle Kingdom billionaire Jack Ma was temporarily disappeared. We thought he was permanently disappeared, only to resurface later. And the connection to be made here was the fact that he said some off-putting things about the government of the Middle Kingdom. More recently, a famous Chinese actress who allegedly committed tax fraud has been fined something to the effect of $46 million. And it's likely that even if she has committed tax fraud, she doesn't necessarily owe that much. So we see this again and again, and more recently I talked about the video game ban in the Middle Kingdom. And so these are obvious flexes, but they are in fact manifestations of what we might describe as more traditional forms of authoritarianism. And these are things that are at least not overtly practiced in the West. There are other things that go on in the West, and that would be a separate discussion, but not at the level of China. And probably most significantly is the fact that the pestilence, for better or worse, whatever the ultimate specifics of its origin, originated in the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom did not act with one iota of responsibility towards the rest of the world with respect to the pestilence. And it can get away with that because of certain financial relationships that exist between the Occident and the Middle Kingdom. So certain things that the Middle Kingdom does would be effectively considered to be anathema in the West, whether it's the United States or Europe. But on the note of the Great Pestilence, there is the question that has emerged in the wake of its emergence as to whether or not governments throughout the West have become more authoritarian in an overt, very visible manner that they hadn't been in previous decades. Now, many people view the circumstances of the pestilence to be such that it is perfect grounds for the West becoming more authoritarian, taking advantage of the situation, etc., etc. But really the crux of the question when it comes to these questions of authoritarianism versus less authoritarianism is efficiency. People often remark that a place like the Middle Kingdom is quote-unquote more efficient in some ways. It can simply do what it wants to do. It can fine people. It can introduce mass bans. Many of you might know that it's not just the Middle Kingdom. In Singapore, for example, no conventional drugs are allowed. Alcohol is, after the age of 18, but every other drug that we would consider to be a conventional drug is not allowed, and oftentimes the penalty for that is the death penalty. And people can cite that and say, look, it works. There's a famous quip about alcohol in the American context in the 20s, the Prohibition era, how Prohibition doesn't work. And the great lesson that we'd learned was that in the 1920s, the United States government tried to prohibit the consumption of alcohol, and it didn't work. And many people viewed this as a kind of axiomatic lesson to be learned from this period in time. But Singapore managed to do it. You could argue that it's a city-state, and that's the reason why it's so much easier, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. But it is more efficient in a sense. Singapore has no drug problem that we're aware of. The United States has all kinds of drug problems. Wander the streets of San Francisco or LA, or wander some small town in Ohio or Indiana, and you will see all sorts of drug problems. And most people would agree that Drug problems are generally not a good thing to have. But we can see, at least in the case of Singapore, that yes, it's efficient. But the question that arises from all of this is, what does it come down to? When we talk about governmental efficiency, we're not talking about the benefits of that efficiency with respect to the citizens. Joe Smith is not necessarily benefiting from a highly authoritarian Singaporean or Middle Kingdom government. He simply is there. He might be benefiting in some way. Maybe in a different dimension he might have become a drug addict, and so he doesn't have access to those drugs. But he's not the one who's directly benefiting from it. He might believe that he is benefiting from the restrictions and ordinances of the government. But just to reinforce the point here, he is not the primary beneficiary. So when people talk about efficiency and how much better it is to have authoritarian government, sure, but it doesn't mean that you, the citizen, are necessarily enjoying it. In fact, you probably wouldn't be. The matter of culture and history is important as well. Prohibition did not work in the United States, and if they tried again, it certainly wouldn't work any better because of different history, different peoples, different cultures, all of these things coming together, creating indeed a very, very different set of circumstances for things of that nature. But the million-dollar question, of course, is in the light of the pestilence. Many places, even in the United States, have decided to mandate the use of the anti-pestilence elixir, if you know what I mean. The anti-pestilence elixir is probably the single most polarizing and disruptive political issue of our time. I am blown away by how the topic of the anti-pestilence elixir has riven friendships, families in twain. It's actually pretty bonkers if you think about it. Now, I'm highly ambivalent about the anti-pestilence elixir. I don't have a strong position on it one way or another. Personally, I think forcing people to imbibe the anti-pestilence elixir would be a bad thing, but there are debates raging on in many places of the world, specifically in the West, things we never would have thought to be an issue. So, for example, I know that in New York City, there is right now a debate about mandating the imbibing of the anti-pestilence elixir. Various universities, most of them private institutions in the United States, have required the consumption of the anti-pestilence elixir to be able to study there, to be present, and so on. And there is that creeping fear, of course, in light of this, that maybe, in fact, Western governments are edging towards a system that is more akin to the system in the Middle Kingdom. And it's understandable because maybe Western governments see that things are, quote unquote, more efficient in the Middle Kingdom in this regard than they are in the West. Now, of course, even if Western governments wanted to go there, starting with the requirement of mandating the anti-pestilence elixir, because for better or worse, Western governments are democratically elected governments, meaning people vote for them in a way that doesn't occur in the Middle Kingdom or in other places where effectively the person who is elected for life. And so that would be a big obstacle to becoming extremely authoritarian in the sense of the Middle Kingdom and other places. But it seems to be on these wedge issues, and you can debate whether or not the anti-pestilence elixir is a wedge issue, that Western governments have fewer issues being authoritarian. So, for example, we'd almost never get a situation in Europe or the United States where there would be proscriptions against the amount of hours you can play video games per week. It sounds absolutely absurd, even though the Middle Kingdom is doing this. But when it comes to other things, people are a lot iffier. Video games presumably don't affect everybody else. When it comes to this matter of the anti-pestilence elixir, or the pestilence itself, because there are, for better or worse, diverse opinions on it, it is a much more salient issue to people, because many people feel that the anti-pestilence elixir should be a requirement, because if you haven't imbibed it, you are a public hazard to people. That's a view that a lot of people have. And Other people on the other side of the fence feel that the government forcing you to make personal choices about your body is a tricky issue. Now, I'll submit to you again, as somebody who is very ambivalent about this matter of the anti-pestilence elixir, that it is by no means a clear-cut issue. For example, alcohol, we were talking about this earlier, is a deadly toxin. I would argue the deadliest drug civilization has known, just in terms of sheer body count, destruction it causes socially, health-wise. It destroys lives. And drunk drivers destroy lives too. But nobody is going to attempt to tell people in the West, you cannot drink alcohol, despite the potential. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, but with regards to the anti-pestilence elixir, it's not too dissimilar. So the question is, where do you draw the line? My own view when it comes to this authoritarian issue is, it sounds nice on paper, but again, the person, the citizen who's subjected to these authoritarian measures is not the beneficiary of these things. He's not the person that is getting off on this stuff. He's ultimately a pawn of sorts. Bureaucrats, government institutions definitely like it, enjoy it, but it really is a question of what you prefer. Do you prefer to have a country that can get things done on the drop of a dime by way of the most draconian measures, or do you prefer the comparable mess that we have in the West? And I have to say for myself, on balance, because I'm not a huge fan of authoritarianism, I probably prefer the mess of the West, all the while granting that it is a mess and our countries are not doing very well, and they might even be at a distinct disadvantage compared to the Middle Kingdom. Like so many things in life, it comes down to personal preference. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please hit the like button, subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. Please hit that bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos. YouTube throttles my views, and so hitting that bell icon is helpful. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Take care. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.